I thought the worst thing that could happen on a Tuesday evening was burning dinner. I was wrong. I was so catastrophically, blindly wrong that when I finally understood what had happened, I had to sit down on the kitchen floor because my legs simply refused to hold me up any longer. My husband of 11 years, the man I had built a life with, the man I had trusted with everything I had, including my daughter, had opened our front door and told my 14-year-old child to leave. Not in anger, not in a moment of madness he would immediately regret. He had said it calmly, with his mother standing behind him, her arms crossed, her lips pressed into a thin, satisfied line. He had chosen her, over Emma, over me, over everything we had ever called a family. And the most devastating part, the part that still wakes me up at 3 a.m, even now, months after everything unraveled, is that I had seen it coming. Not this exact moment. Not the image of my daughter standing on the porch with her backpack and her wet eyes, but the shape of it, the slow, creeping shadow of it. I had seen the warning signs and told myself I was overreacting. I had smoothed things over and swallowed my words and smiled through dinners that felt like interrogations. I had done everything a reasonable, patient woman is supposed to do, and still, it wasn't enough. It was never going to be enough. This is the story of how I lost my marriage, found myself, and saved my daughter, not necessarily in that order. Our life before Diane arrived was not perfect. No life is. But it was good. It was genuinely, quietly, beautifully good in the way that ordinary things are good when you've worked hard for them and know their value. We lived in a house I had bought 3 years before I met Daniel. A pale yellow craftsman on a tree-lined street in a neighborhood where people still wave to each other from their driveways. I had saved for the down payment for 4 years, working double shifts as a hospital administrator and eating cereal for dinner more nights than I care to admit. The house had good bones and terrible wallpaper, and I had stripped every wall myself, weekend by weekend, playlist by playlist, until it looked the way I had always imagined it could. By the time Daniel moved in after our wedding, the house was mine in the deepest possible sense. Not just legally, not just financially, but spiritually. Every repaired baseboard and repainted shutter and replanted flower bed was a piece of me. Emma was 10 when Daniel and I married. She had been 3 when her biological father walked out of our lives with the casual indifference of a man returning a library book, and she had no real memory of him. Only the vague, abstract understanding that some fathers stay and some don't. Daniel had been different from the start. He had taken her seriously in the way that children desperately need to be taken seriously. He had learned her favorite dinosaurs and her opinions about pizza toppings and the exact way she liked her hot chocolate. 2 marshmallows, not 3, because 3 was too many and they get in the way. He had been, for 4 years, exactly the father she deserved. Our mornings had a rhythm I loved fiercely. I would wake up first, always, some internal clock that never slept past 6, and go downstairs to make coffee while the house was still dark and quiet, and entirely mine for those 20 minutes before the world began. The kitchen smelled of old wood and dish soap, and on good mornings, the ghost of whatever we'd cooked the night before. I would stand at the window with my mug and watch the street slowly lighten, and I would feel, in those minutes, something close to complete. Emma would come down at 7, still half asleep, her dark hair in a cloud around her face, and she would sit at the counter and talk to me while I made her breakfast. Real conversations, the kind you don't expect to have with a teenager, about books she was reading and things that had happened at school and ideas that had occurred to her in the middle of the night. Daniel would appear last, already dressed, smelling of the cedar soap he always used, and he would kiss the top of Emma's head and pour himself coffee and ask what we were discussing, and we would tell him. And for a while, the 3 of us would stand in that warm, messy kitchen and be exactly what I had always wanted us to be. That was the life I was protecting. That was the thing I didn't know was under threat. Diane first came to visit 6 months before everything fell apart. She had lived in Phoenix for most of the decade, near Daniel's younger sister, and before that call, the one where Daniel told me, with studied casualness that his mother was coming to stay for a few weeks while she recovered from a knee procedure. I had met her maybe 8 or 10 times total. Holidays. One summer visit that lasted 5 uncomfortable days. She was not a warm woman. She was not a cold one either, exactly. She was something more precise than that. Diane was a woman who had decided long ago how the world should be ordered, and who regarded anything that deviated from that order as a personal inconvenience directed specifically at her. She arrived on a Wednesday afternoon in October, her silver sedan packed with enough luggage for a season. I remember standing in the driveway watching Daniel carry her bags inside and thinking that there were a lot of them for someone who was staying a few weeks. I remember the way Diane looked at the house as she got out of the car, not with appreciation, not with the warmth of someone arriving somewhere they feel welcome, but with the careful, assessing gaze of someone taking inventory. Her eyes moved over the porch, the garden, the windows, and then she turned to me and smiled, and her smile was technically correct in every way and empty of anything I could name. "Clara," she said. She always said my name as though it were a mild inconvenience. "The house looks the same." "We repainted the shutters last spring," I said. She looked at the shutters. "So you did," she said, and went inside. Emma, to her credit, tried. She really did. She was 14 by then, sharp and funny and possessed of a teenager's uncanny ability to read adults, and I think she understood from the first day that this visit was going to be difficult, but she set her jaw, and she was polite, and she offered to show Diane her room and asked if she needed anything, and Diane accepted all of this with the gracious patience of someone accepting tribute. They were never going to be friends, but I genuinely believed, that they could manage a peaceful coexistence. I underestimated catastrophically what Diane actually wanted. The first strange thing happened about 10 days in. Emma came into the kitchen after school, dropped her backpack by the door, and began telling me about a project she was working on. Something about ecosystems, full of the enthusiastic detail she brought to anything that interested her. Diane was sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of tea, and she waited until Emma had been speaking for about 30 seconds before she said, without looking up from her cup, "In my day, children didn't interrupt adult spaces without asking permission first." Emma stopped mid-sentence. I saw her face. The flicker of confusion, then the effort to stay composed, the way her jaw tightened. "Sorry," she said carefully. "I didn't realize you were having a conversation." "I'm sitting in the kitchen," Diane said. "That's enough." I looked at Diane. I looked at Emma. I said quietly, but with absolute clarity, "This is Emma's home, Diane. She doesn't need to ask permission to walk into her own kitchen." Diane looked up then, and something moved behind her eyes. Not embarrassment, not apology. Something else entirely. Something that looked, in retrospect, like calculation. "Of course," she said. "I didn't mean any offense." That night, I mentioned it to Daniel. We were in bed, the lamp on his side still on, and I told him what had happened as neutrally as I could manage. He listened. He nodded in the places where nodding seemed appropriate. And then he said, "She's from a different generation, Clara. She doesn't mean anything by it." "She made Emma feel unwelcome in her own house," I said. "Emma's fine," he said. "She's resilient." He turned off his lamp. The conversation was over. I lay in the dark and told myself he was probably right. I told myself I was reading too much into it. I told myself that a few weeks would pass and she would go back to Phoenix and we would go back to our mornings and our kitchen and our ordinary, quietly good life. I told myself this with the conviction of someone who is beginning, somewhere beneath conscious thought, to doubt it entirely. The incidents accumulated the way small things do, each one individually dismissible, collectively damning. Diane commented on the way Emma loaded the dishwasher, on her habit of reading at the dinner table, on her posture, her tone, the way she said yeah instead of yes. Each comment was delivered with that same mild, faintly wounded precision, as though Emma were continuously disappointing her in ways too subtle to name directly. And Emma, who was 14 and brilliant and still fundamentally a child who wanted to be loved, started to flinch. I watched it happen. I watched my daughter, who had never been a flinching person, begin to make herself smaller around her grandmother. She stopped coming down for breakfast when Diane was in the kitchen. She started eating lunch in her room. She started asking me in whispers whether she was going to be in trouble for things that were not trouble at all. Leaving her water glass on the counter, coming home 10 minutes later than expected, laughing too loudly at something on her phone. The few weeks became 2 months. Diane's knee, it turned out, required more recovery time than anticipated, or so Daniel told me. He was spending more time on the phone in the evenings. I could hear the low murmur of his voice through the bedroom door. But when I asked who he'd been talking to, he always said Lisa, with a readiness that I would later understand was practiced. He started deferring to his mother's preferences for dinner, for the thermostat, for which television was used in the evenings. Small things. Such small things. But they were adding up to something I couldn't yet see clearly, like a picture that only resolves when you step back far enough. The first time I found something that should have stopped me cold, I dismissed it entirely. I was looking for the car insurance documents. We were refinancing the mortgage, and the broker needed a particular form. And I was going through the filing cabinet in Daniel's study when I found a folder I didn't recognize. Plain, manila, unlabeled. I opened it expecting tax records or old receipts. Instead, I found a printout of the title to our house, my house. The house I had bought with 4 years of double shifts and serial dinners. The printout had handwritten notes in the margins in a script I didn't immediately recognize. Numbers, dates, what looked like a rough calculation of equity and market value. A cold hand closed around my heart, slow and deliberate. Then I put the paper back in the folder back in the cabinet, and I closed the drawer and went back to looking for the insurance documents. I told myself there was an explanation. I told myself that if something were wrong, Daniel would tell me. I trusted him. 11 years, 4 years with Emma. I trusted him completely. I was so wrong it still takes my breath away. The night it all broke open, I was making pasta. That detail has lodged itself in my memory with the irrational permanence of traumatic images. The water boiling, the steam rising, the smell of garlic and olive oil, the ordinary domestic peace of a Wednesday evening. Emma was at the kitchen table doing homework, her headphones around her neck, her pen moving in quick strokes across her notebook. Diane was in the living room. Daniel was supposed to be home by 7. He came home at 6:45, and he was not alone. I heard the front door open, and then I heard a second set of footsteps, lighter than Daniel's, deliberate, the careful rhythm of someone who has rehearsed their entrance. I turned from the stove, and behind my husband walked a woman I had never seen before. Mid-50s, dark blazer, a leather portfolio tucked under her arm, and the composed, neutral expression of someone who is paid to remain that way. Diane was already in the kitchen doorway when I turned. She had gotten there faster than should have been possible, as though she had been listening from the moment the car pulled up, as though she had been waiting for this exact scene for weeks. She stood there with her hands clasped in front of her, wearing the expression of someone performing patience. Daniel walked into the kitchen behind the stranger, and the way he moved, head slightly down, shoulders slightly forward, the careful posture of a man navigating something he knows is dangerous, confirmed everything my body had already understood before my mind caught up. "Clara," he said. His voice was the careful voice, the one he used when he wanted something and knew I wouldn't want to give it. "This is Nancy. She's a real estate attorney." The pasta water was still boiling. I noticed it with the strange, irrelevant clarity of shock. The cheerful indifference of the bubbles, the gentle rattling of the lid, the smell of salted water and garlic, and the life I had been living 90 seconds ago. Emma had pulled her headphones off and was watching from the table with the alert, motionless stillness of a child who senses something has broken but doesn't yet know what. Diane moved from the doorway to the kitchen table, my kitchen table, and pulled out a chair and sat down across from Emma with the ease of someone settling into her own home. The portfolio woman stood near the counter, opening her leather folder to a tab she had clearly already marked. "I think we should all sit down," Daniel said. I turned off the stove. I turned around. I looked at this woman with her organized documents, at my husband with his prepared face, at his mother with her folded hands and her careful stillness. I looked at Emma, who was looking back at me with eyes that held the first tremor of something I had spent 14 years trying to keep out of her life. And I sat down, because whatever was about to happen, I needed to be present and upright and completely awake for every word of it. "There's something we need to discuss," Daniel began. "About the house." "My house," I said. He paused. Nancy turned a page in her portfolio. Diane smoothed her sleeve. "Technically," Daniel said, "that's what we need to talk about." Those 9 words. I have thought about those 9 words more times than I can count since that evening. The way they were assembled, the particular choice of technically, as though the truth of something I had built from nothing were merely a technicality, a clerical matter to be sorted out over pasta water and a leather portfolio on a Wednesday. In 11 years of marriage, I had never once heard my husband use that word to describe anything that belonged to me, until that night. What came next took 11 minutes. I know because I was staring at the microwave clock, the same clock I had watched 1,000 times while waiting for water to boil, while checking if the chicken was done. And I watched every one of those 11 minutes tick forward while Daniel explained in the careful, rehearsed sentences of a man who has been coached that his mother had been making significant contributions to the household expenses for the past 2 years, that these contributions had been documented, that she was, with the guidance of her attorney, seeking to have her name added to the deed of the house as a co-owner. The room tilted. Not physically. The walls stayed where they were, the table stayed solid under my hands, but some internal axis shifted, and for a moment the world was a different shape than it had been 11 minutes ago. Emma made a sound, not a word, just a sharp, involuntary exhale, like something had struck her. Diane turned to look at her with an expression of mild, practiced reproach. "This is an adult conversation," Diane said. "She lives here," I said. My voice was very quiet. "This is her home. You don't get to—" "Clara." Daniel's voice firmer now. "Let Nancy finish." "I know what a real estate attorney does," I said. I was looking at him, only at him. "How long have you been planning this?" He didn't answer. He looked at the table. And in that precise, specific moment, when my husband of 11 years looked at the table instead of at me, I understood the full shape of what I was looking at. Not just tonight, all of it. The phone calls, he said, were with Lisa, the few weeks that had become 2 months, the careful erosion, inch by inch, of the boundary between his family of origin and the family we had built together. He had not been ambushed tonight. He had been building toward tonight. He had helped design it. "How long?" I asked again. "Mom needed somewhere stable," he said. "After the knee, after everything. She's been helping us, Clara. The property taxes last year, the HVAC when it broke. It's not unreasonable for her to want—" "Get out of my kitchen," I said. Absolute silence. Emma was very still. Nancy had stopped turning pages. Diane tilted her head precisely like a bird assessing something small. "Not you," I said to Daniel. "Her. Both of you. Out of my kitchen. Out of my house." What happened next shattered everything. Diane did not get up. She sat back in her chair, almost leisurely, and she looked at Daniel. Not frightened, not defiant, but checking in, the way a commanding officer looks at a subordinate before an order is given. And Daniel, my husband, the man who had learned my daughter's dinosaur preferences and her 2 marshmallow rule, looked back at his mother, and then looked at Emma. And what he said next, I will never, not in any version of my remaining life, forgive. "Emma," he said, "go to your room." Emma stared at him. "What?" "You're being disrespectful to your grandmother. Go upstairs." The silence after that sentence was unlike anything I had ever experienced inside a house. It was not empty. It was full, dense, with everything none of us were saying. Emma looked at him for a long moment. Her face did something I had never seen it do before. It went completely still, the way a face goes still when something fundamental breaks. Then she looked at me, and I saw in her eyes, 14 years old, still the girl who knew every dinosaur fact Daniel had ever taught her. The question no child should ever have to ask her mother with a look alone. Is this real? Is this happening? Is he really doing this? Emma, I said, and my voice broke on her name just slightly. You don't have to go anywhere. She's always been disrespectful, Diane said. You've let her run wild, Clara, and then you wonder why she has no manners in her own home. She has more respect than anyone in this room, I said. That's enough, Daniel said. To me, not to his mother, to me. Emma, upstairs, please. Emma stood up. She picked up her notebook. She gave Daniel one final, long, level look, the look of someone committing something to permanent memory. And she walked out without a word. I heard her footsteps on the stairs. Her door closed. And then there were 3 adults at my kitchen table, and 2 of them had been planning this for longer than I wanted to know. I waited until Emma was asleep that night, until the house was completely quiet and Daniel had retreated to the guest room. Then I went to his study and opened the filing cabinet and took out the manila folder and photographed every single page with my phone. I sat at his desk and read the documents carefully for the first time, and what I found was worse than I had imagined. The folder didn't just contain the deed printout, it contained a draft quitclaim document, a document that would have transferred partial ownership of my house to Diane Hargreaves, dated 3 weeks prior, unsigned, waiting for my signature. A signature Diane had apparently been entirely confident she could obtain. My hands did not shake. That steadiness frightened me a little, because it told me that some part of me had already known, had known for weeks and refused to look directly at it, and was now simply done pretending. I called my father at 11:30 that night. He picked up on the second ring, the way he always has in every crisis of my adult life. I told him everything. He listened without interrupting, and when I finished, he said, "Don't sign anything. Don't discuss anything further without an attorney present. I'm coming tomorrow." The night between Daniel's confession and Diane's departure was the longest of my life. I lay in the room I had shared with my husband for 6 years and stared at the ceiling and went through everything. Every scene, every smoothed-over incident, every moment where I had told myself I was overreacting, and he had nodded and helped me believe it. I thought about the evenings he'd spent on the phone while I made dinner, the careful ways he'd described his mother's contributions as gifts, in the rare moments he mentioned them at all. I thought about the times Emma had come to me with her careful, whispered questions. Am I going to be in trouble for this? And how I had reassured her while privately dismissing the instinct that had prompted the question. Her instincts had been right. She had read the situation clearly from the beginning, with the unclouded perception of someone who had nothing at stake in wanting it to be different. I got up at 2 a.m. and went to Emma's room. I didn't knock. I just opened the door very quietly and looked in, and she was asleep with her lamp still on, a book splayed open on the pillow beside her, her dark hair across her face. I stood there in the doorway for a moment. The room smelled of her lavender hand lotion and the particular musty comfort of old paperbacks, and I thought, this room, this lamp, this child, this is what I am protecting. Everything else is negotiable. This is not. I went back to bed and I did not sleep, but I was no longer afraid. I called a family law attorney before Daniel came downstairs in the morning. Patricia Reyes had been recommended by a colleague who had survived her own version of this story. I reached her voicemail. She called back within 40 minutes, and we spoke for 35 minutes. By the end of the call, I had an appointment for the following afternoon and a clear list of immediate steps. What Patricia said landed like something solid. Informal financial contributions do not create property rights, and any attempt to leverage them toward a deed modification, particularly one drafted without the property owner's knowledge, constituted, in her words, a matter worth examining very carefully. That word, examining, carried weight I could feel. Daniel came downstairs at 7:30. He stood in the kitchen doorway and said, "Clara, sit down," I said, not unkindly, just clearly. He told me the rest over the next 20 minutes in the halting, self-justifying pieces of a person dismantling a lie that has become too heavy to carry. His mother was not planning to return to Phoenix. She had never intended to return to Phoenix. The recovery had been the pretense that got her in the door, but the plan, discussed and refined over those phone calls he attributed to Lisa, was for Diane to become a permanent resident of our home, a co-owner, a legal, unchallengeable presence. He had managed the money transfers. He had contacted Nancy. He had scheduled the ambush for a Wednesday when Emma had homework and I was making pasta, and the house smelled of garlic and everything felt ordinary. He had done all of it, and he had been prepared to sit across from me and call it a conversation about the house. "Is there anything else?" I asked. He looked at his hands. "She was going to move in permanently," he said, "into the spare room, long term." The spare room, Emma's art space, the room with the trailing philodendron and the shelves of sketchbooks. I looked at Daniel across my kitchen table, and I felt something settle in me. Not anger, but its colder, more permanent cousin. Clarity. A door closing on something that had been hanging open for far too long. My father arrived at noon. He sat down across from Daniel and said, without raising his voice, "Tell me what you've done to my daughter's house." And Daniel, stripped of his mother's architecture, told him everything within 15 minutes. That afternoon, Patricia reviewed the photographs, the quitclaim draft, the bank records showing 3 transfers from Diane's account to the joint account over 8 months. Transfers I had never been told about, that Daniel had let slide through our shared finances while I was busy trusting him. Patricia also told me something I hadn't expected. Daniel had approached Nancy's firm not once, but twice. The first contact had been 4 months prior, a preliminary inquiry about adding a name to a deed without the primary owner's signature, which Nancy had advised was not legally possible. The second contact, 3 weeks before that Wednesday, had resulted in the quitclaim draft. 2 attempts, 4 months of planning. I sat with that number, 4 months, and calculated backward. Emma's first whispered question had come 4 months ago. Her instincts, as I have said, had been exactly right. Patricia looked at me across her desk and said, "Your name is the only name on this deed. You haven't signed anything. That is the most important fact in the room right now." I went home and told Daniel that Diane had 72 hours to leave the house, that I had documentation of the quitclaim attempt, that if it became necessary, I would not hesitate to pursue formal action regarding the unauthorized financial transfers. I said all of this very quietly in the kitchen while Emma was upstairs. Daniel stared at me as though I were a person he had never seen before. Perhaps I was. Perhaps the woman he had married had been too careful, too committed to keeping the peace. And peace, I had finally learned, is not something you can keep by giving ground indefinitely. At some point, the ground runs out. "You can't just—" he started. "I can," I said, "and I will." Diane left the following morning without a word to either of us. The divorce took 8 months. It was not clean, but it was fair. I had documentation, and Patricia was thorough, and Daniel, confronted with the full written account of what he had participated in, did not have the energy left for a prolonged fight. He kept his car, his savings, his tools. I kept the house. I kept Emma. Those were the only 2 outcomes that had ever mattered to me. Diane faced a formal complaint to Nancy's firm, combined with Patricia's documented letter. I heard she returned to Phoenix and told her version of events to anyone who would listen. I chose to find that entirely irrelevant. Emma asked me, 6 weeks after Diane left, whether I was sad about the divorce. We were in the kitchen on a Saturday morning, she eating cereal, me drinking coffee, nowhere to be. I thought about the question honestly before I answered. "I'm sad about what I thought I had," I said. "I'm not sad about what I actually had." She considered this. "That makes sense," she said, and went back to her cereal. "That is my daughter." Clear-eyed, precise, constitutionally unwilling to perform emotions she doesn't feel. She is, at 14, a better judge of situations than I was at 38. I am not embarrassed by that. I find it one of the most hopeful things I know. Nearly a year later, I was standing at the kitchen window with my coffee at 6 in the morning, watching the street slowly lighten. The house smelled of wood and dish soap and the ghost of last night's dinner. The spare room was Emma's studio now. Her art supplies, her books, the trailing philodendron finally given the space it had always deserved. My name was the only name on the deed, as it had always been meant to be, and I had a copy of that deed in a fireproof box at the back of my closet, and I knew exactly where it was, and I knew exactly what it said. The pale yellow craftsman on the tree-lined street was mine. It had always been mine. I had simply needed to stop apologizing for that. Some foundations don't crack under weight. They just show you, finally, what they were made of all along. Mine held. And so, it turned out, did I.